Hello, little ones. Welcome to our story time. Learning English with Bible stories helps your child grow twice in understanding and wisdom. Listen to these stories as many times as you need to understand, learn, and remember. Adults can use them too. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any lessons. Today's story is about Abraham and God's promise from Genesis 12. Let's begin. Chapter 1, God's Call to Abraham. Once upon a time, in a place called Ur, there lived a man named Abraham. Abraham was a good and kind man. He loved his wife, Sarah, and his nephew, Lot. Abraham took care of his family and his many sheep and camels. They all lived together happily. One day, something amazing happened. God spoke to Abraham. God said, "Abraham, leave your country, your family, and your father's house. Go to the land I will show you." Abraham was surprised and a little scared. He had never heard God's voice before. But God continued, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. All the families on earth will be blessed through you." Abraham thought about what God had said. It was a big decision. Leaving his home and family would be hard. But Abraham trusted God. He knew that God had a special plan for him. So, early the next morning, Abraham began to pack. He told Sarah, "God has spoken to me. We must leave our home and go to a new land. God will show us the way." Sarah was surprised, but she trusted Abraham and agreed to go. They packed their tents, clothes, and all their belongings. Abraham told his servants to get the sheep and camels ready for the journey. Lot, his nephew, also decided to go with them. As they were preparing, the neighbors asked, "Abraham, where are you going?" Abraham smiled and said, "We are going to a land that God will show us." The neighbors were curious and amazed. They wished Abraham and his family a safe journey. Abraham, Sarah, Lot, and their servants started their long journey. They walked through fields and valleys, over hills and mountains. Sometimes it was hot, and sometimes it was cold. But they kept going because Abraham trusted God's promise. Along the way, they saw many new and wonderful things. They met different people and saw different animals. Abraham always reminded his family, "God is with us. He will guide us to our new home." At night, when they stopped to rest, Abraham would build an altar. He would pray to God and thank Him for guiding them. Abraham's faith was strong, and he believed that God would keep His promise. Sarah and Lot also prayed and thanked God for their safe journey. They felt blessed to have Abraham leading them with such faith and trust in God. Day by day, they continued their journey, always looking ahead to the new land God had promised. Abraham's heart was filled with hope and trust, knowing that God was leading them to a wonderful future. And so, Abraham and his family kept moving forward, following God's call with faith and courage. Chapter 2, The Journey Begins. Abraham and his family were on a grand adventure, traveling to a new land that God had promised them. They packed up all their belongings, loaded their camels, and set off on their journey. The road was long and full of challenges, but they were excited and hopeful. The journey began early in the morning, just as the sun was rising. The golden light made the fields and hills look beautiful. Abraham led the way, with Sarah by his side and Lot following close behind. Their servants walked with them, guiding the sheep and camels. The caravan moved steadily, everyone working together. As they traveled, Abraham often spoke to his family about God's promise. "God has promised to show us a land where we will be blessed," he said. We must trust him and keep moving forward. They walked for many days, stopping to rest when they needed to. During the day, the sun was hot and bright. The travelers drank plenty of water and rested under the shade of big trees whenever they could find them. At night, they would set up their tents and gather around the fire. Abraham would tell stories of God's goodness and pray for guidance and protection. On their journey, they saw many wonderful and new things. They crossed wide rivers with clear, sparkling water. They walked through green valleys filled with beautiful flowers. They climbed rocky hills where they could see far into the distance. Each new place was different and exciting. One evening, as the sun was setting, they arrived at a beautiful meadow. Abraham decided it was a good place to camp for the night. They set up their tents and built a fire to cook their food. As they sat around the fire, Abraham said, "Let's give thanks to God for guiding us today." He built an altar with stones he found nearby. Everyone gathered around, and Abraham prayed, "Thank you, God, for watching over us and showing us the way. Please continue to guide us and keep us safe." Sarah and Lot joined in the prayers, and their hearts were filled with gratitude. They knew that God was with them, protecting them and guiding them. Even though they had left their home and everything they knew, they felt safe and hopeful because of God's promise. The next day, they packed up their camp and continued their journey. They met new people along the way, some who were kind and offered them food and water, and others who were curious about where they were going. Abraham always shared the story of God's promise, and how they were traveling to a new land that God would show them. One day, as they walked through a dense forest, they heard the sound of a stream. The cool, refreshing water was a welcome sight. They stopped to rest and let the animals drink. Abraham took this moment to remind his family, God provides for us every day. He gives us water to drink and food to eat. Let's always remember to thank him for his blessings. As they continued their journey, they faced different challenges. Sometimes, the path was rocky and hard to walk on. Other times, it rained, and they had to find shelter quickly. But no matter what happened, Abraham always trusted in God's promise. He encouraged his family to stay strong and have faith. One night, after a long day of traveling, they camped on a hill. The sky was clear, and they could see countless stars twinkling above them. Abraham looked up and remembered God's promise. He told Sarah and Lot, "Look at the stars. God said our descendants would be as numerous as these stars. Even though we can't see it now, we must believe in his promise." Sarah smiled and said, "I trust in God's promise. He has been with us every step of the way." Lot nodded in agreement, feeling comforted by the thought of God's promise and the bright future ahead. As they lay down to sleep that night, the sound of the wind in the trees and the gentle rustling of leaves made them feel peaceful. They knew that no matter how long the journey or how difficult the road, God was with them, guiding them to the promised land. And so, with faith and hope in their hearts, Abraham, Sarah, Lot, and their entire caravan continued their journey. Each step brought them closer to the land God had promised, and their trust in God's plan grew stronger every day. Chapter 3: Reaching Canaan. After many days and nights of traveling, Abraham, Sarah, Lot, and their servants finally began to see signs that they were nearing the land of Canaan. They were tired but excited. They had faced many challenges along the way, but their faith in God's promise kept them moving forward. One bright morning, as the sun rose, they climbed a high hill. When they reached the top, Abraham stopped and looked out over the land. Below them stretched the beautiful land of Canaan. It was a land of green fields, flowing rivers, and tall trees. Abraham's heart filled with joy. This was the land that God had promised to show them. Abraham turned to his family and said, "Look, this is the land God has promised us. He has brought us here safely, just as he said he would." Sarah and Lot looked out over the land and smiled. It was a wonderful sight, and they were filled with hope and happiness. They began to descend the hill and entered the land of Canaan. The people living there were different from those they had met before. Some were friendly and welcomed them, while others were curious about the newcomers. Abraham always shared the story of their journey and God's promise. He told them how God had spoken to him and led them to this beautiful land. As they settled into the land, Abraham decided to build an altar to thank God. He found large stones and carefully placed them on top of each other. When the altar was finished, Abraham gathered his family around it. He lifted his hands to the sky and prayed, "Thank you, God, for bringing us to this land. We trust in your promise and are grateful for your guidance and protection." The days passed, and Abraham's family began to explore their new home. They found fertile fields where they could plant crops and rivers where they could get fresh water. They set up their tents and began to build a new life. Abraham was always mindful to thank God and remember his promise. One day, as Abraham was walking through the fields, God appeared to him again. God said, "To your descendants, I will give this land." Abraham felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude. He knew that God's promise was not just for him but for his children and their children. This land would be the home of his family for generations to come. Abraham shared God's words with Sarah and Lot. "God has promised this land to our descendants," he said. "Our family will grow and prosper here." Sarah and Lot were filled with joy and hope for the future. They knew that they were part of something special and that God had a wonderful plan for them. Abraham continued to build altars and worship God in different places throughout the land of Canaan. Each altar was a reminder of God's promise and a symbol of Abraham's faith. People began to recognize Abraham as a man of God, and they respected him for his trust and devotion. As time went on, Abraham's family grew. They were blessed with many children, and their flocks and herds multiplied. The land of Canaan was indeed a land of blessing. Abraham's trust in God had brought them to a place of abundance and happiness. One evening, as the family gathered around the fire, Abraham spoke to them about God's promise. "Remember," he said, "God has given us this land and promised that our descendants will be as many as the stars in the sky. We must always trust in him and follow his guidance." The family listened and nodded, understanding the importance of Abraham's words. They knew that their journey was just the beginning of a great story that God had planned for them. And so, in the land of Canaan, Abraham and his family thrived. They lived with faith and gratitude, always remembering God's promise and the incredible journey that had brought them to their new home. Chapter 4: A Test of Faith. Abraham, Sarah, Lot, and their growing family were settling into their new life in the land of Canaan. They felt blessed to be in the land that God had promised them. The fields were fertile, their flocks were thriving, and their family was happy. But soon, a great challenge arose. One year, there was a terrible famine in the land. The rain stopped, and the crops began to wither. The rivers dried up, and there was very little food and water for everyone. Abraham knew he had to find a way to keep his family safe and fed. So, he decided to take his family to Egypt, where there was still plenty of food. Before they left, Abraham prayed to God for guidance. "Dear God," he said, "please protect us on our journey to Egypt. Help us find food and keep us safe until we can return to the land you have promised us." With faith in his heart, Abraham led his family south, to Egypt. The journey to Egypt was difficult. They walked through dry, dusty deserts, where the sun was hot and the wind blew sand in their faces. The animals were tired and thirsty, and the people grew weary. But Abraham never lost faith. He kept encouraging his family, saying, "God is with us. He will guide us and keep us safe." When they finally reached Egypt, they saw that it was a land of plenty. There were green fields, tall palm trees, and the mighty Nile River flowing with fresh water. The people of Egypt were busy and prosperous. Abraham was relieved to see that there was food and water for his family. However, Abraham was also worried. He knew that the Egyptians might not be friendly to strangers, especially since his wife Sarah was very beautiful. He was afraid that the Egyptians might harm him to take Sarah. So, he told Sarah, "When we enter Egypt, tell them you are my sister. This way, they will treat me well because of you, and our lives will be spared." Sarah agreed, and they entered Egypt. Just as Abraham had feared, the Egyptians noticed Sarah's beauty and praised her to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh took Sarah into his palace and treated Abraham well, because he believed Sarah was Abraham's sister. He gave Abraham sheep, cattle, donkeys, servants, and camels. But soon, God sent plagues upon Pharaoh and his household because of Sarah. Pharaoh realized that Sarah was actually Abraham's wife. He called Abraham and said, "Why did you say she was your sister? Now take your wife and go." Pharaoh was angry, but he allowed Abraham and his family to leave Egypt safely. Abraham, Sarah, Lot, and their servants left Egypt with all the gifts they had received. They returned to the land of Canaan, grateful to God for protecting them. Despite the fear and challenges, God had been with them every step of the way. Back in Canaan, they found that the famine had ended. The land was green again, and there was plenty of food and water. Abraham built another altar and worshipped God, thanking him for his protection and guidance. "God has kept his promise," Abraham said. "Even in difficult times, he has been with us and brought us safely back to our home." Lot and the rest of the family were also grateful. They had seen how God had protected them in Egypt and brought them back to Canaan. Their faith in God grew stronger, knowing that He was always watching over them. Abraham continued to trust in God's promise. He knew that there might be more challenges ahead, but he believed that God would always guide and protect his family. He reminded his family, "We must always have faith and trust in God, no matter what happens. He will keep his promises to us." As the days went by, Abraham and his family worked hard to rebuild their lives in Canaan. They planted new crops, tended to their flocks, and strengthened their community. The land once again became a place of abundance and blessing, just as God had promised. Through this test of faith, Abraham and his family learned that God is always faithful. Even in the hardest times, God's promise remained true, and their faith in Him grew even stronger. They knew that with God by their side, they could face any challenge and overcome any obstacle. Chapter 5: God's Promise. Abraham, Sarah, and their family had settled back into their life in the land of Canaan. They had faced many challenges, but through it all, their faith in God had remained strong. They knew that God had a special plan for them and that His promise would come true. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky was painted with beautiful shades of orange and pink, Abraham went for a walk. He climbed a small hill and looked out over the land. He thought about all the promises God had made to him and how God had guided and protected his family. As Abraham was praying, God spoke to him again. "Abraham, look up at the sky and count the stars, if you can. That is how many descendants you will have." Abraham looked up and saw countless stars twinkling in the night sky. He was filled with awe and wonder. It seemed impossible to have so many descendants, but Abraham believed God. God continued, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur, to give you this land to take possession of it." Abraham remembered the long journey they had made from their old home to this new land. He thought about all the times God had protected them and provided for them. Abraham asked, "O Lord, how can I be sure that I will possess this land?" God told Abraham to bring a special sacrifice. Abraham obeyed and brought the animals God had asked for. He laid them out as a sacrifice, and as he did, he felt God's presence strongly. As the sun set and darkness fell, a deep sleep came over Abraham. In his sleep, God spoke to him in a vision. God said, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward, they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age." When Abraham woke up, he felt a deep sense of peace. He understood that God had a great plan for his descendants, even if it would take many years to come true. He knew that God was faithful and that his promises were sure. The next day, Abraham shared the vision with Sarah and Lot. "God has spoken to me again," he said. "He has promised that our descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Even though they will face hard times, God will bring them out and bless them." Sarah and Lot listened with amazement. They were inspired by Abraham's faith and the greatness of God's promise. They knew that their family was part of something very special. Years went by, and Abraham and Sarah continued to wait for God's promise to be fulfilled. They grew older, but their faith did not waver. They continued to worship God and live righteously, trusting in His plan. One day, when Abraham was 99 years old, God appeared to him again. God said, "I am God Almighty, walk before me faithfully and be blameless. I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers." God changed Abram's name to Abraham, which means father of many nations, and Sarai's name to Sarah, which means princess. God said, "I will bless Sarah and will surely give you a son by her. She will be the mother of nations, kings of peoples will come from her." Abraham laughed with joy. He could hardly believe that he and Sarah, at their old age, would have a child. But he trusted God completely. He knew that nothing was impossible for God. And just as God had promised, Sarah gave birth to a son. They named him Isaac, which means he laughs, because they had laughed with joy at God's promise. Abraham and Sarah were overjoyed. They knew that Isaac was the beginning of the fulfillment of God's promise to them. As Isaac grew, Abraham often told him about God's promises. He taught Isaac to trust in God and to believe in His promises, no matter how impossible they seemed. Isaac grew up with faith in his heart, knowing that he was part of God's great plan. Abraham continued to live a long and blessed life. He saw his family grow and prosper in the land of Canaan. Even as he grew old, he always remembered God's promise and trusted in His faithfulness. And so, Abraham's story is a testament to the power of faith and the certainty of God's promises. God had promised to make Abraham the father of many nations, and through his descendants, all the families on earth would be blessed. Abraham's faith and trust in God's promise became a foundation for generations to come. Through Abraham's journey, we learn that God's promises are true and that faith in Him will guide us through every challenge. Abraham's story encourages us to trust in God's plan for our lives and to believe in His promises, no matter how impossible they may seem.